Tonight's guest speaker is Jill Swann, and her topic, Mitcham Dairy Company at Carrick Hill. Jill worked as a teacher and a teacher librarian from 1970 to 2006, and she has researched, written and produced history resources in print media and online for students and teachers, and also researched the historical background for her family history. In 2002, Jill became the first student to graduate with a master's degree in studies in art history in the joint enterprise program between the University of Adelaide and the Art Gallery of South Australia. Last year, she returned to study as one of the inaugural students in the Curatorial and Museum Studies program, which included cultural heritage research at Carrick Hill. Jill is currently working with the curator of the Cedars at Hahndorf in cataloguing the private collection of Nora Hyson, and also tells me she's one of a group of 13 training to be a guide at the Art Gallery of South Australia. Please make welcome Jill Swann.
Thank you, David. Well, it's lovely to see such a big audience. In the talk I'm going to share with you tonight is a version of the findings from the project I worked on last year for the director of Carrick Hill, Richard Heathcote. My research focused on what was happening on the Carrick Hill site before the Hayward era. Essentially, it is the story of a building that was at the heart of a successful colonial agribusiness and later various farming enterprises. After a clever adaptation, this building enjoyed a second life as an essential element of Lady Hayward's gardening regime before its subsequent demise in 1986. I just need to step down and up that visual, which you might have seen on the walls at Carrick Hill. And it's an aerial view of the property, as you can see, in the 1950s. They had regular aerial surveys when the Haywards were there. First, I'll explain just a little of how I became involved with this project. As David mentioned, in 2007 I was a student in the Adelaide University's inaugural Curatorial and Museum Studies program. The origin of my research of the Mitcham dairy lay in a question that was submitted by Richard Heathcote, the director of Carrick Hill, for consideration by students for their major cultural heritage assignment. The question said simply, research a lost building, the Mitcham Village Dairy in the grounds of Carrick Hill. My interest in researching, writing and interpreting social history led me to put this question at the top of my list of possible choices. I had made many visits to Carrick Hill since its first opening to the public, but before making a final decision to pick up this project based on a little-known aspect of the site, I was curious to know where exactly the lost building had stood and how it fitted with what is currently recognised as the cultural heritage of the property. I realise the visual might be a little bit far away for some of you to see, but you can see the main house in the photograph. If you venture up the steps to the south of the main building and through the hedge to the outer garden, the site that I was researching is up there beyond that hedge. In the visual you can see there is a cottage, and the dairy itself is what appears to be a white roofed building, but it's actually, I think, the sunlight bouncing off the glass which had been installed for Lady Ursula's glass house. So it was up in the back there by the orchard, which no longer exists. And that's where it is. In a preliminary discussion and walk around the site with Richard Heathcote in March 2007, I told him that I was confident I could research the information he needed, but was doubtful that I could also make it into a 9,000-word research paper, which was required for the major course assessment. At first viewing, as you can see, the subject was little more than a patch of brown grass, and I wasn't entirely convinced of the presence or otherwise of the ghosts of milkmaids which Richard, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, seemed to think would be lurking. After doing some pre-reading and Valleys of Stone, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with and which is a marvellous book, I considered the likely tools for my research and gained a deeper appreciation of the need for this particular story to be told. I might add that the director's enormous enthusiasm for gaining the whole picture of the heritage of Carrick Hill helped me to confirm my choice. 3 months later, in June 2007, the patch of grass was somewhat greener and I had completed a paper that easily extended beyond the required 9,000 words to 13,000. In fact, the first draft was over 20,000 words, and it ended up looking like this. Eventually, the assignment was evaluated for my course, and most importantly, Richard had his question answered without a consultant's fee, but also, not surprisingly, without the sight of a single milkmaid's ghost. The completed document had to meet the requirements for evaluation in an academic course, thus the thesis has 4 chapters. Most of what I will present tonight is an edited version of the second chapter, which is the historical detail relating to the Mitcham Dairy Company, together with selected parts of the third chapter which deal with the later demise of the dairy buildings at Carrick Hill. I'll briefly summarise the paths I took, which will be familiar to most of you. At the Land Titles Office in Grenfell Street, I took details from titles for the period from 1836 to 1970 relating to the site, and all the details are in the appendix if people want to look at them later. These revealed the succession of landowners of the property we now know as Carrick Hill, and more specifically Section 891 of the 100 of Adelaide. I also visited the Mitcham Heritage Research Centre, where I received marvellous support from Maggie Raglas, whom I believe is here tonight, and also at the State Archives in Lee Street, so that I could access the Mitcham Council rates assessment books. Searching, reading and noting microfilm records, or the gigantic rate books themselves for each year's rates, handwritten by the clerks of the 1800s and the early 1900s, is a fascinating if time-consuming task. But that one line in each year's records revealed vital information. The appendices of my research documents the owners' and tenants' names, the valuations and the land use of the site, and most importantly, the details for the period beginning 1880 when the Mitcham Dairy Company was established. I was following 2 main lines of inquiry at the same time: the history of the dairy in the 1880s and the records of decisions made which led to its demolition in the 1980s. As it happened, in the same week, I discovered the information in the rates records confirming the birth of the dairy on one day, and on the next, the death of the dairy as recorded in the Carrick Hill Committee minutes. At the State Library of South Australia, colonial newspapers offered reports of the dairy's planning, structures, operation, personnel and stock. Other local history records indicated lessees' ongoing uses of the property before its acquisition in 1927 by Springfield Real Estate Company, and during the decade 1927 to 1937 before the Haywards made their purchase. So what is the story of the lost building, with or without the dairymaids or their ghosts? To set the scene for the story of the dairy's development, I'll skip really quickly through a little of the earlier history of Mitcham. You can see that very clearly, but it's one of the very early plans of Adelaide. For some 50,000 years before European settlement, the land we know of as the southern suburbs was occupied seasonally by a subgroup of the Ghana people known as the Lady Hordes, who ranged along the southern foothills to the sea. One of their favoured camping grounds was Wirraparinga, or the Scrub and Creek place, now known as Brown Hill Creek. In 1834, the British Parliament passed the Foundation Act establishing the colony of South Australia. Within months of landing in December 1836, the first settlers had set off for the gorges in the foothills. The South Australian Company, founded by George Fife Angus, bought large parcels of land at reduced prices. Following the survey and naming of Brown Hill Creek in 1837, the South Australian Company set up a short-lived sheep station with 1,800 ewes and lambs there. The company's land at Brown Hill Creek on Section 248 eventually became the site for the village of Mitcham, which was the first urban settlement established by private land sale in the rural area surrounding Adelaide. Mitcham Road, now known as Fullerton Road, directly connected the growing village of Mitcham to Adelaide. Quarries opened in the hills, and other employment was readily available in mines, on local small farms, gardens and orchards. A school opened in 1847, and 3 licensed pubs were operating by 1851. The next year, St Michael's Church was completed and in use, the District Council was established, and the village already boasted 56 houses with numerous other dwellings in the valley beyond. By the 1870s, beyond Adelaide's parklands, on land now covered by the suburbs, were numerous farms with open paddocks, orchards, olive groves, vineyards and market gardens, and several villages such as Mitcham. Wealthier families owned estates of up to 250 acres within a few miles of the city centre, and many of these were sited along the foothills between Mitcham and Magill. Substantial homes built in the 19th century and early 20th century in the Mitcham area south of here included Springfield, Delamere, Corriga, Urbray and Torrens Park. People were always considering new enterprises, and these enterprises included dairies, such as the Mitcham Village Dairy. Before we look more closely at this particular dairy and its operation, it's interesting to first consider dairying as an industry in the colony at large. The very first publications carrying notices about the British settlement of South Australia also ran advertisements for all things needed to set up home and businesses in the new colony. These ads included those for items related to the manufacture and storage of dairy produce. The first dairyman in the colony was the notable settler John Barton Hack, who arrived from Van Diemen's Land in February 1837 with his family and considerable farming assets, including 6 heifers and 1 bull. Hack cheerfully recorded his pleasure at being the first to milk a cow in the colony and began the first commercial dairy and milk walk, as opposed to a milk run, in North Adelaide. He and his wife also sold dairy produce through the window of their North Adelaide front room. Sanitation and hygiene in the management of cows in the colony and the production and sale of milk left a little to be desired and was already the focus of scientific study by the 1870s. Scrupulous cleanliness in the industry unfortunately remained the exception rather than the rule. It was common for milk to be set in rooms that were also used for storing bacon, onions, harness and other farming items. It was reported that consumers could receive their freshly made butter wrapped in any cloth at hand, including old sheets and shirts with buttonholes and buttons intact. Therefore, great opportunities existed for innovative operators with a focus on hygiene and the marketing of premium quality produce. Realising this need, a consortium announced its plans for a new business, the Mitcham Dairy Company. On the 2nd of August 1878, a group of gentlemen led by Mr John Prince, a name well known in Mitcham, met at the Imperial Hotel to plan the formation of a company to start a dairy farm near Adelaide for the purpose of supplying the city with pure milk. The group's members were all associated with the Mitcham district, with a diverse range of business backgrounds. They included William Townsend, an auctioneer and agent, who was Mayor of Unley, Lord Mayor of Adelaide and later a Member of Parliament, C. Mallon, a storekeeper, postmaster, brewer and racehorse trainer, together with W.N. Crowder, a cordial manufacturer, G. Sampson, a baker and grocer, F. Townsend, a wheelwright, D. Deans, a builder and carpenter, and John Prince himself, who was a local contractor. Not one dairyman among them. At the meeting, a plan was hatched to form a company with a capital of £3,500 in shares of £1 each, with power to increase to carry on the business of a dairy farm. If the scheme collapsed, the group believed that the property could fetch a fair price in the market and minimise the risk for the investors. Mr Prince stated that a suitable property at Mitcham was in view, with direct tramway access to the city nearby. The committee was to draw up a prospectus and make inquiries about a suitable property for a farm to report to a future meeting. Their idea was to copy new dairying practices reported to be in use in London. Following this meeting, little else was published of these plans until in 1881, when the Mitcham Dairy Company was reported in operation by at least 2 colonial publications. However, different names were listed as the owners. I'll just step back for a moment and briefly talk a little more about the details of who owned the land. It's of the Mitcham area in 1857, with the sections marked out. Section H91 was eventually surveyed and granted on 7th of April 1841 to a fellow called Alfred Miller Mundy. 40 years later, on 22nd of June 1881, Charles Burton Hardy purchased some 95 acres which comprised portions of sections 891 and 892. Hardy was a successful solicitor living in the Mitcham district. In 1870, he had purchased his grandfather's property, the 10-room Springfield house, on 138 acres, situated on the northern portion of section 891. In 1881, Mitcham Council first records Hardy as paying rates for his newly purchased extensive acreage described as grassland only. Hardy bought further adjoining land in January 1882. Following the reported establishment of the Mitcham Dairy in October 1881, the Mitcham Rates Assessment Book for the year ending 30th June 1882 and again in 1883 3, there are records of the rates paid jointly by Mr Hardy and a Mr Horn, his partner, for a 930-acre property of grassland only. Horn is listed in the SA directories as Hardy's partner in the Mitcham Dairy Company, but as both were solicitors, it is unlikely they had much involvement in its day-to-day operations. In 1884, Hardy and Mr E.H. Irwin were listed as proprietors of the company. So how did the dairy operate on a daily basis? Well, colonial journalists reported extensively on the progress of the dairy farm in October 1881. The South Australian Register noted that the farm had begun operating on the 1st of October at Upper Mitcham. The location was described as a few hundred yards back, at the back of the pretty little English church, on the side of a gentle declivity from which a splendid view of the Gulf and the intervening plains can be obtained. The property was described as being of about 1,200 acres, upon a good part of which the feed is now quite thick and strong. Some of this land was cultivated for growing fodder crops to feed cattle during the dry summer months, and there were plans to extend the acreage further, using the large quantity of manure for fertiliser. The dairy operated in an extended complex of buildings constructed from stone quarried in the hills behind the site. The dairy proper, as the reporter described it, that is, the building in which milk and cream was stored, was highly innovative. It was half sunk in the ground, 15 feet long by about 12 feet in height, the floor being cemented with a fall all round to the centre where there is a trap sink connected to a pipe, carrying off all water to a distance. Thick stone walls had recessed windows and a door opening from the outside. Ventilators were constructed at the top of the interior walls of the sunken building, which were at ground level on the exterior, and this is how the building looked. Both windows and ventilators were fitted with wire gauze to keep out dust and insects. Extra cooling was achieved with a ceiling of close flooring boards and seaweed as insulation between the ceiling and roof. Around the interior walls were 2 wide tiers of slate shelves that could store 75 large milk pans, each holding about a gallon of milk, and I haven't converted that. I think we all remember what gallons were or are, which was set for the cream and butter production. The slate shelving was supported on pillars and not attached to the walls, enabling maximum circulation of air all over the building. And of course, it didn't have glass in that time. That was the glass that was put there for Lady Ursula's gardening. The manager dairyman and his wife were reported as being brought up to the business, producing real country butter of old England of an excellent quality. This reference to the dairyman's wife may suggest her ghost may be heard in lieu of the milkmaid's. The house was situated just below the dairy, and attached to it were the other employees' quarters, with nothing left undone to secure their comfort. But as you can see, the comfort had long gone when these photos were taken. According to the South Australian Register, milking began every day at 4 a.m. in a compact shed just below the house. It is believed the milking shed was on the ground where the great house at Carrick Hill now stands. 10 cows could be simultaneously baled and milked by hand. During milking time, it was a young lad's sole task to release the cows from the bales as they were milked and lead in the unmilked cows. Now, of course, I don't have a picture of that, but I did find on Picture Australia, which is that marvellous database that you can access on the web, was a photograph in a dairy that I imagined very similar to the one that was at Carrick Hill. The milkers worked from one end of the stalls to the other, milking each fresh cow as it was ready and then returning to the beginning until all the cows were processed, and they did it all over again every afternoon. Not one dairymaid is mentioned as being involved in the work. The comfort of the cows was as well considered as that of their keepers, with roomy bales, each with a manger at the front and falling slightly to the back. And I might just remind you that all of this information was in this quite fulsome newspaper report. A double row of bales or stalls with a passage between had the cows standing head to head, and at one end of the passage was a storeroom for chaff or meal, and an open culvert ran the length of the milking shed to keep it clean and dry. Adjacent was a large yard, complete with more feed racks where the cows were penned while waiting to be milked. Other buildings were necessary for the operation of the dairy farm and its associated activities. A second large shed, which held about a dozen milk delivery carts, abutted the fodder storeroom. More pens held calves, which needed to be separated from the cows. The horses were sheltered and fed in the same building. Further below the dairies were pigsties, all under a roof, with each pen containing from 2 to 10 pigs separated from each other by a most ingenious contrivance of gates. For efficient cleaning, these cement floors sloped towards one main channel. The waterworks, which had been opened in November 1879, back further in the hills, and built on land formerly owned by Charles Hardy, uphill from the dairy, conveniently provided year-round supplies of fresh water for the Mitcham dairy. Numerous pipe and hose points saved the laborious task of carrying either water or milking equipment for cleaning. Cows' and pigs' water troughs in the yards were simply gravity-fed by pipes and ballcocks, and the milking stalls and pigsties could be efficiently cleaned with a hose. The effusive reporter was at great pains to emphasise these hygienic practices, and I quote, "All the refuse from dairy, stables, yards and sties is made to gravitate to a place much lower down, where it is taken care of, and by proper treatment prevented from becoming a nuisance. The downhill slope is availed of in numberless ways to save labour, and in carrying of slops, etc., it is most effective in keeping a place sweet." I couldn't help but think as I was reading and recording this fulsome description that it had more than just a little of the flavour of the advertorials we commonly read in publications today. Now, quite recently, about a month ago, Maggie Raglas from the Mitcham History Centre contacted me, and she had come across in their records something that we hadn't found a year ago, and that was the Mitcham Local Board of Health report for July 1883, specifically dealing with the many dairies in the Mitcham area at the time. I might say that none of them were anywhere near as big as the Mitcham Dairy Company. But I'll just read to you what the health report said, which I think lines up pretty well, even so, with the reporter's quite fulsome description. There are a few statistics here too. It said, in July 1883, the Mitcham Dairy Company have in all about 200 cows, 80 of them in milk. They are on runs at Mitcham and Coromandel Valley, when at the dairy they are all watered from the main. There are 3 large yards. The one nearest the sheds is paved. The milking sheds are paved and roofed, built with stone and iron, and are built in a very satisfactory manner, in such a manner that they may be cleaned in a very quick and satisfactory style. There are about 60 pigs on the premises, and there's accommodation for 100 more, so it's quite a big show. The sties are all built with masonry, have iron roofs and cement floors. The milking and the milk sheds are thoroughly washed daily. 36,000 gallons of water were used during the last 4 months. The dairy is located on a hillside, and the drainage is used as fertiliser to produce green fodder. 7 men live at the dairy, for which there is ample accommodation, large sleeping room, large mess room, cook's room, kitchen, overseer's cottage, etc. The place is in a healthy situation, with plenty of room for men and cattle, well drained and well managed as regards cleanliness. The milk is sent to the depot in Angus Street, Adelaide, and from there sold retail. Now, the dispersal of the milk in 1883 had changed a little from the earlier report, which I'll get to in a moment. The cows were described as chiefly the common sorts, but also included were a few nearly pure Alderney cows and a very fine Alderney bull, and the pure Alderneys are now an extinct breed. And as I searched for a suitable illustration of an Alderney cow, I remembered the A.A. Milne poem from my childhood and teaching days, which featured not only an Alderney cow, but a dairymaid. And I wondered if Richard's imaginings of ghosts of dairymaids had originated in the same poem. The Alderneys were similar to Jerseys and Guernseys, small, slender-boned and docile animals, ideal for colonists to manage on the long voyages to South Australia, and once they had reached the colony. And you can see that photograph there. The children are quite young children, so they were quite a small cow, like the little Jerseys that we still see. They were prized for their passive natures and copious milk supplies, which produced very rich cream and butter. The Mitcham Dairy Company's premium milk supply from their Alderneys and their commoner sorts of cows was delivered to customers who applied by letter to be supplied with a specific quantity once or twice a day. The dairy company was also happy to hire out their cows on a rostered basis to customers requiring a large supply of pure milk. Prices charged for milk were so competitive that the company claimed that a large family of children could be treated to milk and bread every morning at a lower cost than for any other food. The more economical skim milk was also available. Milk was transported by the dozen milk carts previously mentioned to Mitcham and all townships between there and Adelaide, as well as South and North Adelaide and Norwood and Kensington for a penny per quart twice per day. So this was in the early stages of the company. They were doing their own deliveries. They're not their carts, but they are milk carts that were in use at the end of the 19th century around Adelaide. Skim milk was sold at 9p per gallon and cream for about 1 shilling per pound. The company undertook to supply butter year-round at 1 shilling per pound. Bulk supplies were even cheaper and everything was guaranteed pure. And as I said from the report that Maggie gave me about a month ago, later on they sent their supplies to Milk Depot in Angus Street. The Mitcham Dairy Company operated for at least 5 years, but after 1887 the company is not listed in the council assessment books. So the brief history of the Mitcham Dairy Company had come to an end, but the buildings and property remained. New occupiers continued, running cows and other stock and making use of the extensive improvements. But by 1889, even the term dairy ceased to be used as an annotation in the council's rate books. On 27th of September 1888, Benjamin Henry Andrews, listed as a dairyman in the Sands and McDougall directory, began leasing the Hardys' land. Not quite a decade later, in 1897, Charles Burton Hardy sold his properties to Frank Rymel. Andrews, the dairyman, continued leasing the farmland and buildings from Rymel, the new landlord, and subsequently from his widow Annie until 1908. Robert Simons was the lessee from 1908 until 1934, running the property as a dairy farm or for general stock grazing, until well after it was purchased by the real estate company Springfield Limited. Through the 1920s, this very different company from the Mitcham Dairy Company of the 1880s surveyed the land around the farm buildings with a view to developing it for an entirely new use, an exclusive housing subdivision. On 24th of September 1927, Springfield Limited purchased Mrs. Frank Rymel's property. The directors of the real estate company were James Council, a public accountant, A.E. Clarkson, managing director of Clarkson's retail store, and real estate brokers Keith Wilkinson and Hubert Sando. There were promotional brochures, and there's a copy of one at Carrick Hill. Sometimes it's on display, and I realise again you probably can't see that from where you're sitting. These brochures advertised a suburb of state-of-the-art homes in secluded, picturesque and spacious settings, immune from the encroachment of inferior buildings, and just a short drive by car from the city centre. So these clearly indicated on the plan with a note, these buildings will be demolished. Through the Depression years, while the developers waited for this parcel of land to sell, there was a succession of short-term lessees on Section 891. H. Evans, T. Jones, T. Wolfwood and H. F. Packham. Packham's son Howard, the youngest of 7 children, was born in 1930 and spent his childhood and youth in the Mitcham area. He offered recollections of his Depression boyhood for inclusion in the Mitcham School history written by Charles Cornwell in 1997. The Packham family of 9 lived in the cottage on Section 891 of the Springfield real estate land from 1933 to 1937. Howard's father was often unemployed, at times working as a gardener. Some of Packham's 5 older sisters worked as maids at Springfield, housemaids, not dairymaids. Howard recalled that a man who did not live on the farm kept cows and came to milk them in the sheds sited below the cottage. The Packham family left the cottage when the Haywards purchased the land. On 15th of January 1937, Edward and Ursula Hayward became the owners of Section 891, which included the buildings of the former Mitcham Dairy. The remaining farm machinery continued to be useful in the grounds and gardens of the property they developed. Carrick Hill House was duly built, and during the creation of the gardens planned by Ursula Hayward, the dairy was adapted for use as a glass house or hothouse. And of course, some 60 years' deposits of cow manure was in place to fertilise all her lovely garden beds. Mr. Cliff Jacobs was the estate's gardener through the Hayward era, both before and after World War II, and continuing until his retirement in 1987. Mr. John Draper, head gardener at Carrick Hill from 1985 to 1992, and then last year when I interviewed him, he was the head supervisor of trees on the Burnside Council. I think he might still be in that position, but he was a young gardener from the Adelaide Botanic Gardens who was seconded to help tidy up Carrick Hill. He talked about Cliff Jacobs, Ursula Hayward's gardener, as a true gentleman and a lovely old stick who could outwork all of us. He told me lots of stories too that would be best not to put into print. Draper remembers many stories Cliff shared with him and also some descriptive details about the dairy buildings. The cottage was used as accommodation for Sir Edward's War Services Batman, who retired and lived on the Hayward property after World War II. And he continued to work for Sir Edward as his chauffeur. After the chauffeur's death, the cottage was no longer occupied. By the 1980s, gardening staff were accessing only the timber lean-to extension at the rear of the cottage. John Draper described this lean-to room, built on red gum stumps, as a garden storeroom for tools, seeds and chemicals. There were also boxes of old Country Life magazines and seed planting charts pinned to the walls, as Lady Hayward had brought collections of seeds from the United Kingdom. Garden frames and stakes were stored against the outer rear wall. The main part of the building was in grave disrepair in 1984, and John Draper does not recall ever entering the interior rooms, but remembers seeing old milk cans stored inside. Most of the floors had collapsed or were in a poor state. The side walls under the veranda were hung with disused horse collars and bridles. After the farm machinery, which was also stored there, was placed out in the open, in 1985, the veranda collapsed completely. The additional room on the northeastern side of the cottage was large and square, with a cement floor and rendered walls. This structure was completely overgrown with creeper and almost derelict by 1985. Cliff Jacobs used the former dairy as a glasshouse to maintain the prize-winning cymbidiums and dahlias during the winter months, but this use possibly ceased following Lady Hayward's death in 1970. John Draper described the roof as retaining its pine rafters and plate glass till 1985, with the benches in place still but filled in around their former columns. So what happened to the dairy glasshouse following Sir Edward Hayward's death in August 1983? The Carrick Hill archives, that is the minutes of meetings of Carrick Hill Committee of 1974, of the steering and interim committees from 1983 to 1985, and of the early meetings of the Carrick Hill Trust, record the proposals and management decisions regarding the dairy buildings from 1970 to the present. Notes by the first director, early annual reports and minutes of the Grounds and Gardens Committee meetings add further detail. These documents record the demolition of the Mitcham dairy buildings, which predated the later South Australian Heritage Places Act of 1993 and the revised 1999 ICOMOS Australia Borough Charter for the Conservation of Places of Cultural Significance, and that acronym ICOMOS is for the International Council of Monuments and Sites, and the charter was developed here at Borough in 1999. In the Carrick Hill Interim Committee minutes of 21st of January 1985, the cottage was described as being in a very dangerous state and needed to be protected from the public prior to it either being restored or preserved as a ruin. No reference was made at that time to the dairy glass house. These buildings were not deemed culturally significant at the time, and any restoration was to be delayed. Thus the buildings could only deteriorate further over the ensuing years. It would seem that any perceived need for retaining the crumbling buildings would diminish, further supporting a rationale for demolition. With planned tours imminent during the 1986 Jubilee year, public safety was a priority. The estate was placed on the interim list of the Register of State Heritage Items, gazetted on 1st of August 1984, and the description was simply House Carrick Hill. There were no further references to the Settlers' Cottage and Glass House until the Trust meeting of 21st of January 1986. Concern was minuted about the ongoing deterioration of the Settlers' Cottage, which by then had very severe cracks and only one area reasonably stable. Discussions regarding the dairy glass house and cottage did take place, but no details of that discussion are recorded. Trust members moved, seconded and passed a motion that the demolition of the Settlers' Cottage and the hothouse, as it was minuted, be effected. So on the 27th of February 1986, a progress report was presented to the Trust confirming that Settlers' Cottage and hothouse had been removed. As John Draper had to supervise the required demolition of the buildings in early 1986, he was able to verify that the foundations of the dairy remain just beneath the ground surface and should be easily excavated in the future by archaeologists. The roof timbers were disassembled and used to fill in the depression in the hillside. Once the building was completely demolished, excess rubble was removed and the ground was levelled out. The locust tree which grew beside the dairy glasshouse door and which remains a healthy specimen today marks the site. Quarried stone from both the cottage and the dairy was recycled to build terrace walls in the Carrick Hill gardens. John Draper regrets that more of the fabric and items relating to the buildings were not saved. His work was constrained by limited funding and the unskilled labour of community service workers, plus the urgent need to get the place safe for public viewing and the planned opening by the Queen. Since the 1986 demolition of the buildings, both the Carrick Hill Conservation Plan of 1997 and the 1999 Landscape Management Plan for Carrick Hill have been published, and included in those reports are statements referring to the lost buildings. These references led Richard Heathcote to seek the information that I have provided him. So, having established the history of the Mitcham Dairy and reviewed the reasons for its loss, it is now the task of the management of Carrick Hill to consider how best to interpret the dairy's cultural significance. Preliminary discussions have been held to plan the archaeological dig of the site by staff and students from Flinders University, and it's hoped that this will be featured in History Week in 2009-2010. Do any of you watch Tony Robinson on ABC's Time Team? I doubt if Tony will make a program at Carrick Hill, but trenches will be dug and geophys surveys carried out, and personnel will deliberate over their finds, and who knows, there may even be evidence discovered of the elusive milkmaids. In closing, I would just like to make a few more serious comments. Contemporary museology considers that the display and interpretation of a cultural object or site is as important as the conservation of the item itself. I used this quotation to introduce the final chapter of my paper, in which I make suggestions for the future interpretations of the dairy's history. I believe that the Mitcham Dairy Company project exemplifies the view quoted here, in that it was the absence of evidence of the Mitcham Dairy's past which indeed provoked Richard's question and subsequently my writing of its history. The presence of this story, and hopefully further narratives, can now compensate for that earlier absence, and as the archaeological dig proceeds in the future, these stories of the dairy site will help us gain a deeper appreciation of the broader heritage of Carrick Hill. Thank you. I can, I may not answer them, may not be able to answer them.
Questions, please.
Or comments.
Yes, no need to be shy.
With the cessation of the dairy activities there, and they were pretty substantial, do you know what company took this over and where they were?
No, it seems as if the company ceased to operate. Now, whether there were financial reasons for that, I don't know, because the owners were solicitors. So perhaps they decided to invest their money elsewhere. So someone just continued on as a dairy farmer rather than a separate company, from my understanding of the records.
It's funny how the world goes. It seems to go around and around in this way in Adelaide all the time. I sat down to speak with Jill before the meeting, and we both thought the other looked familiar, and it turned out that Jill had helped me with some old photographs in her care in the St Peter's College library a few years ago. So tonight was my second encounter with Jill, and what a pleasure it has been for me, and I'm sure for all of you, to have enjoyed her presentation on... It sounds a fairly... Simple's not the right word, but I thought, what do you say about a dairy on a property? But there's obviously a huge amount to say. The research you have done has been very thorough, back into the early times through the records available, and then the more recent times through the oral history. And you've certainly documented an extraordinary little piece of history, and I'm sure that when we next visit Carrick Hill, we'll think of the dairy and locate the locust tree and remember what you had to say. So, Jill, thank you very much.